Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And in my work in classical Catholic education, normally I'm up late at night after the business work of the day is done, after my wife and children get to sleep. And I spend late nights up reading and working. And usually I put a video on in the background to keep me company while I work. And one of the sources of those videos is often the Thomistic Institute's videos that they publish on YouTube, especially their Aquinas 101 videos. Normally, I listen through these things and I actually keep a notebook next to me, and I'll occasionally jot some helpful things down that I hear. Sometimes a reference that I want to look up, things like that. But I generally agree with everything I hear. I'm a lay Dominican myself, so this is usually pretty simple stuff. But in one recent video that I was listening to, and I don't know exactly when this video was produced, but for me, it was the first time that I had watched or listened to the content of it. I was surprised to find something that was said in the video. And I thought to myself, I really don't agree with that. I think that that is a mistake. And I think that in my work in education and the obstacles that I see in K to 12 education, where really a lot of the groundwork is done that influences and to some degree determines the choices that Catholic kids make when they enter into young adult life. I think that this idea that's articulated needs to be examined, and it's attributed to Thomas Aquinas, but I think we need to go and look into the details and find out if what's articulated in this video is actually what is taught by Thomas Aquinas, because I'd like to object. I'd like to say that I don't think this is something that Thomas Aquinas would teach, especially in a modern context. I'm quite certain he never taught it in his own historical context. But I think that this idea is a part of the problem in modern Catholic education and a real obstacle for Catholic students. What I'd like to do, this is a short video, just 5 minutes, and I'd like to just play the video and walk through it. I'm not planning on commenting much until we get to the point where I feel like there's something wrong that we need to examine, we need to discuss, we need to put to the test. And I haven't had the opportunity yet to really dig into it and put it to the test or examine it. But I'd like to share it and ask those who listen, friends of mine, if they would watch this and think about it and provide some feedback as to whether they think that my thoughts are right or wrong, or whether they agree with the video, and most importantly, whether what's said in this video can actually be confirmed with the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas. So let's walk through this video together, and then, like I said, I'll stop when we get to the significant point. Just bear with me because I've got a cold, and I'm trying to keep going here tonight, but I think I'll be okay. But let's watch the video.
How do we understand the act a Christian makes when he says, "I believe"? Is this based purely on some kind of feeling or a subjective inner conviction of heart? Some skeptics would argue that since we don't see directly the truth of the things we believe, believing is fundamentally unreasonable or an irrational thing to do. Now, to answer this question, it will help us to turn to St. Thomas Aquinas and his explanation of the 4 ways that we can respond to a statement. So suppose a friend shows me a newspaper article saying that the local zookeeper is warning everyone that a lion escaped from the zoo last night and might be roaming our streets. And my friend asks me whether I think this is true. Now, I could respond, well, I guess it probably is. I suppose the newspaper editor sent a reporter who did some checking on the story before it was printed, and this kind of response is what Aquinas calls opinion. I affirm the statement, but with a qualification. I think it's likely true, but I don't exclude the possibility that it might be false. But I also might say, well, I'd be surprised if that article were really true. The newspaper is probably exaggerating the danger just to sell more papers. Now, this kind of response is what St. Thomas calls doubt. I negate the proposition, but again, with a qualification. It might be true, but I don't think it is. Or I could say, I know it is true, because I was in my backyard last night and I saw the lion. This kind of response is what Aquinas calls certain knowledge, or in Latin, scientia. It's based either on direct first-person experience or on a valid logical syllogism based on certain premises. I affirm a proposition without qualification because I know it to be true. Finally, I could say, I know the zookeeper, and yes, I do believe him when he says this. This is natural belief. Now, it isn't yet an act of supernatural faith like our faith in God, but it is a reasonable thing to do, to believe another person. I assent to the proposition, what the person tells me, without qualification, even though I don't have knowledge myself about the lion having escaped from the zoo. Instead, I accept this as true based on the word of another, in this case, the zookeeper. On Aquinas' account, then, believing is not principally an inner conviction, and even less is it a feeling. It really involves coming into contact with a truth, coming to have the truth in our minds, even though we haven't directly seen or verified the proof of the statement.
Okay, I'm going to stop there for 1 minute and pick up in just a second. All right, so what we've seen so far is a helpful discussion of 4 different possible responses that we can make to a statement. The first one was opinion. The second one was doubt. The third one was a kind of certain knowledge or science in a classical sense. And then the fourth was qualified as natural belief. So there's 4 possible reactions that we can make to something that someone says to us. Now, listening thus far, I think we would all agree that everything that's been said is pretty clear, and we'd probably all agree with these things, right? How else could we divide the possible responses to something that someone says to us? We either assume it to be true, we assume it to be false, but in both cases we leave some room for the possibility that we might be wrong. And then there's a certainty in knowledge because we have some evidence or reason to know quite surely it's true. And then finally there's faith or a natural belief. Let's stick to the language that's used here. Natural belief, we're not saying supernatural belief. We're not saying this divinely infused grace of faith that leads us to believe in God, but a faith where we trust someone. We trust in the testimony of someone else relating to an issue that we haven't and maybe can't verify ourselves. So up to this point, everything is pretty clear. Now, where I think this video runs off the rails a little bit is in an example that is given with respect to this last response, that of natural belief. Again, everything that's been said so far, I think, is very clear and important and accurately explained and so on. There's nothing I object to in anything that's been said or explained with respect to these 4 possible responses. But what I'd like to object to, and what I think is actually very significant in our generation, is the example that's given of natural belief in this next part of the video. Let's listen.
This kind of belief is eminently rational, and we all do it all the time. Students rightly believe what scientists tell them about the experiments that have generated contemporary scientific conclusions. It would be unreasonable for a chemistry student to verify every experiment in his chemistry textbook before accepting them. Such truths are in principle knowable by direct experience, that's true, but some things, even very important things, are in principle not knowable by direct experience. So for
All right, I'd like to stop there because that was the point that I really object to and want to talk about. And I'm going to go back just to watch that one more time. It starts right around 3:13 or so in this video.
verified the proof of the statement. This kind of belief is eminently rational, and we all do it all the time. Students rightly believe what scientists tell them about the experiments that have generated contemporary scientific conclusions. It would be unreasonable for a chemistry student to verify every experiment in his chemistry textbook before accepting them. Such truths are in principle knowable by direct experience, that's true, but some things, even very important things, are in principle not knowable by direct experience.
Okay, so I'd like to stop there. We went through that twice, so I think you should have a sense of what I'm concerned about. And of course, you can pause this and back up and watch that again. Now, the problem that I have with this, especially with this example of the chemistry student, is that if we think back to the four different kinds of responses that are possible to a statement, the first was opinion. And the explanation of opinion was that we assume it to be true, but we don't leave out the possibility that it might be false. The second, doubt, is that we assume it to be false, but we acknowledge that it could be true. The third is that we have certain knowledge, or scientia, right, the actual classical idea of science, of a certain or demonstrated knowledge. And then fourthly, belief. And the way that the speaker here explained belief was, I know the zookeeper, and he said to me that he saw a lion, and therefore I believe the testimony of the zookeeper. Then we move to this example of a student studying a chemistry textbook. And my question is, which of the four responses is actually proper for that student? Now, obviously, the student must come across something in the reading that he objects to or isn't certain of. So the question again is, what would the right response be? Would it be to accept it as true, but acknowledge that it could be false? Would it be to assume that it's false, but acknowledge it could be true? Obviously, it can't be the third response, which is to receive it with as certain knowledge. And then fourth, to believe that it's true. Which of the four responses would be appropriate for a student studying from a chemistry textbook? And the speaker here says that the fourth response would be reasonable. The fourth response would be right, to believe the textbook. Now, I have a problem with that for a number of reasons. First of all, the student does not know the source of the textbook, as the example was given for belief. We said, I know the zookeeper, and he told me that he saw it, and therefore I don't believe this statement, I believe the zookeeper, because I know him. In this example of the chemistry student doesn't know the author of the textbook. He doesn't know the scientists who have testified to any particular bit of information, any assertion that's been made. So the condition of that natural belief doesn't apply to a student studying a chemistry textbook. Besides, notice in the example of belief, it was that I know the zookeeper and he told me that he saw a lion. So there's sort of a direct link, one step from me to someone I trust who had direct observation. So I don't think that the condition of that fourth response applies to a student reading a chemistry book. Rather, I would say that a student reading a chemistry book should respond with the first response, which was opinion. That is to say, I have reason to think that this is true, but it could be false. And what happens here is the reason this caught my attention, and again, I was explaining that I usually listen to these videos in the background while I work, just sort of keeping myself company. And this really struck me because at first I couldn't believe what was being said, because I think this reveals a major problem in modern Catholic academics. Imagine if you're this student, or if you're a chemistry student and you watch this video, and then you open your chemistry textbook and you read things that you think contradict the Catholic faith. Should you actually think that to question them is unreasonable, or that you're some kind of crazy person if you think that something in your chemistry textbook might not be true? If you doubt something in your chemistry textbook, are you unreasonable? Should you simply believe the author of a chemistry textbook? I really don't think that that's the right way to approach the study of a subject like chemistry. I should say, especially a subject like chemistry. And I think what we see here is this habit that's developed in modern society of just trusting in something that's called science with little or no criticism, with little or no suspension of belief. I would say if you have a reason to think that this textbook is a good textbook, let's say you have a good teacher that you trust, a good professor, and he chose this book, and you can look in the front of the book and see the list of the contributors to the textbook, and you say, wow, these are some impressive scientists who contributed the content to this book. None of them are infallible, and to be honest, I have no idea if these men have observed the demonstration of these statements in the book in the same way that the zookeeper, whom I know, saw the lion and told me that he saw the lion. Now imagine if I talked to the zookeeper and I said, did you see this story in the newspaper about a lion being loose? And the zookeeper says, oh yeah, that's true. And I respond and say, how do you know that? And he says, oh, because Steve, one of the custodians here at the zoo, told me. Well, I don't know Steve. So I go and talk to Steve and I say, hey, are you Steve? My friend Bob, the zookeeper, told me that you saw a lion out here last night. Is that true? And whatever the custodian's name was, I forgot. But he says, oh, actually, no, I didn't see it. Mary, one of the ladies who works in the kitchen, told me that when she was closing up last night, there was a lion. Well, now we've got a more complex situation, because I know the zookeeper. I don't know this custodian. I don't know this kitchen lady. And now I've got this chain of reports that someone saw a lion. But I don't really know who saw that lion. None of the people that I'm talking to actually saw that lion. It's just been this game of telephone with this reporting from one to the other. And so when I hear the story, I am not presented with a story that I should receive by faith. And so it leaves me with one of the first two options, which is I can either give the benefit of the doubt to the story. I don't know if that's a very helpful phrase to use here, but I can just assume it to be probable, but acknowledge that it might not be true. Or I can just doubt it and say, bah, I don't believe that. That's nonsense. But at the same time, if someone could give me some evidence, I would believe it, but I don't have any evidence. So there's doubt, right? When we come to this chemistry situation, I think this is what Catholics have come to think when they approach modern studies like mathematics and the natural sciences. They've learned to accept this modern philosophy of science, which really has nothing to do anymore with the original philosophy on which modern science was founded. If we go back to the scientific revolution, back to the 1600s, and actually read what was being written, it was very clear that the fathers, like Francis Bacon, the fathers of the scientific revolution, they believed that trusting in Aristotle or trusting in Plato or trusting in the Pope or trusting in the apostles or trusting in Moses or trusting in the doctors of the church or the saints was all superstition and a source of all kinds of errors throughout history. They made it very clear that they were in opposition to this whole idea of trusting the sources. That was the fundamental issue that Francis Bacon rejected. The whole idea of the scientific revolution was the human race is filled with ideas that have never actually been proven or observed. They've never been demonstrated. And we're specifically referring to things in the natural world. Our knowledge of the material world is largely based on things that have been proposed by theologians and philosophers, by prophets and apostles, and we have just collected these things and passed them on from one generation to the next without any examination, without any testing. And so the whole idea of the scientific revolution was that we really have no idea if anything that we think is actually true. And so what we need to do is hit the reset button on human knowledge and just start from scratch. Let's just start from scratch. Let's not assume anything anymore as regards the natural world. But let's make it a rule that anything that you say about the natural world is going to require evidence. It's going to need to be tested. It's going to need to be reproducible. It's going to need to be demonstrable. And anything that can't be reproduced or tested or demonstrated is simply not scientific knowledge. And that was the rule of the scientific revolution. So when we come to a subject like chemistry, the whole point of the natural sciences, the whole point is to provide evidence. That's the whole point. So if you say a student should read and trust the source, learn from his chemistry textbook, write it down in his notes, regurgitate it on the exam, tell it to his students, and they should just continue that, copy, paste. That's actually the opposite of what the scientific revolution was intended to be or intended to do. In fact, all that we've done is we've gone from believing in philosophers and theologians, in apostles and prophets, and we've simply changed from believing in that sort of man when he speaks about things natural, to giving our trust to a different kind of men, a different class of men, men who are not apostles or prophets, men who are not philosophers or theologians, at least who at least don't identify as philosophers or theologians. But what's happening is that they're acting like apostles and prophets. They're acting like theologians, delivering some kind of tradition of knowledge that's just being passed down from one teacher to a student, from that student to another student, and so on, line after line. So I think that what's happened here is we've allowed this shift to take place where science is no longer accountable to its own principles. Natural sciences are no longer held accountable to evidence. They're no longer held accountable to demonstration. And so we've got this concept of the textbook, the science textbook, which is like an encyclopedia of assertions, none of which come with evidence. And the student is handed this textbook, and usually in the first chapter, they have some sort of introduction to science where they talk about all of these ideas of the scientific method, of hypotheses, of testing, of observation, how this is the only means by which we can have science of the natural world. And yet, as soon as we move into chapter 2, there's just this downloading of assertions, topic after topic after topic, with no evidence. And so if the student, and it's especially true when chapter 2 usually starts with something like evolution, or an explanation of how the world is millions of years old, or how these things developed from the Big Bang, we're immediately disconnected from what we just talked about with hypotheses and testing and evidence and the need for demonstration, and the fact that we shouldn't accept anything unless it can be demonstrated by experiment and observation and so on. And now when this student raises his hand and says, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I need to see that to believe it. Right? He says, I don't believe in evolution. There's no direct evidence of evolution. Is he now to be accused of being unreasonable? Because if he doubts the content of this science book, which presents assertions to him with no evidence, if he doubts them, is he actually being unreasonable? I don't think he is. I think he's actually acting within his rights as a student, especially in a subject that's supposed to be following the rules of natural science and the scientific method. And this is what happens. You see, this student is now scoffed at, he's now criticized, and what he's actually doing is exaggerated to appear ridiculous. He may object to a certain point. And for example, there may be teaching about atoms and protons and electrons and neutrons and quarks, and it just keeps going and going into greater and greater complexity, all of which is invisible. The professor or teacher has never observed an atom. He's never seen an electron or a proton or a neutron, has never seen a quark, and yet he's asserting these things in a natural science class. And the student asks, how do you know that atoms really exist as material objects? How do you know with science, with certain knowledge based on actual demonstration or observation, how do you, chemistry teacher, know that atoms actually exist, or that protons actually exist, or that quarks actually exist? How do you know that that's true. That teacher does not have demonstrative knowledge. He does not have certain knowledge. And what we find is that he himself has accepted that teaching without evidence, which is not scientific. But we might say, okay, that's okay, it's reasonable, because we can't test every single thing that is said. But then we ask, well, where did you learn that? And he says, well, I learned it from this book over here, which I studied when I was in high school. And you see what's happening is we've now got multiple levels of belief in a subject that is supposed to be based not on belief, but on demonstrable material evidence. Yes, there is an aspect of modern science which is hypothetical. That's the hypotheses. That's the hypothetical part. The theories are the hypothetical part. But the assertions are not supposed to be theoretical. They're not supposed to be assumed. They're not supposed to be received by faith. They're supposed to be demonstrated. And yet what we see in the lives of students is that there have been generations and generations and generations of teachers and students, none of whom have ever observed the things that they assert to be true. And if anyone objects, he gets this treatment that he's some kind of crazy person, as if everyone has observed this. And the truth is that these people have not observed this. And what I would like to know, and I've had these discussions with scientists, what I would like to know is who has observed this? If you make an assertion, I would like to know this assertion that you've made, who has actually observed the truth of that assertion? Now, the nature of science, again, if we go back to the scientific method, the nature of scientific knowledge is that it's based upon evidence that's direct, empirical evidence. And the quality of this empirical evidence is that it's supposed to be reproducible. It's supposed to be reproducible. So if you see it, someone else should be able to see it. Otherwise, you realize we just get into this total wackiness. So for example, I look at my phone here and I say, oh my, I just saw this amazing thing. And I put my phone away and I say, oh, well, now I know that that's true because I saw it. And I'm telling you that this is true. And you say, well, can I see it? And I say, oh, well, no one else, you can't see it. That's not normal communication. And that certainly isn't a source of scientific knowledge. And the fact that I claim to have evidence, but don't let you see it, if anything, is a cause for doubt and distrust rather than trust. If I say, oh, I've seen it here in this video or in this picture that I have, but I'm not going to show it to you. I'm going to present it to you without evidence, and I'm going to tell you that you need to accept the truth of this based on my testimony concerning what I have seen. And I present that as scientific truth or scientific information. If the evidence is on hand, why don't you share the evidence? And this is my question. Someone, somewhere, for something to have become a scientific truth, someone somewhere had to have material evidence that it was so. And for it to qualify, according to the scientific method. For it to qualify as scientific evidence, it has to be reproducible. So if I look up at the stars in my telescope and I say, ooh, 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 look what I just saw. I just saw this and this and this. And then you go to look through the telescope and I say, up, too late, it's gone. There's, you can't see it. That would not be scientific evidence. And modern science, from the time of the scientific revolution, has rejected that kind of information. For example, Moses claimed that he saw a bush burning that was not consumed. This is direct evidence. Moses testifies that he saw a burning bush in the land of Midian, 1400 years before Christ, claims that he saw a burning bush that was materially not being consumed by fire. It was a miraculous event. He claimed that from that burning bush, an audible voice was heard that identified itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and revealed his name as I am. Now, to Moses did not receive that by faith. Moses received that as science. Moses saw it and heard it with his eyes and his ears. Moses did not believe in the burning bush. Moses saw it. Moses heard it. The problem is that Moses heard it and saw it alone, and then went and told people about it, and they had to either believe him or doubt him. And then God, after showing himself to Moses, commands Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. And Moses is like, look, I know that this is true, but Pharaoh doesn't know that this is true. And Moses says to himself, I'm not going to go to Pharaoh and tell him that I saw a burning bush and heard a voice from a bush that told me that I'm like the chosen deliverer of the people of Israel. That's just not credible. It's not realistic. Why would that be believed? I wouldn't ask someone to do that. And so what happens? God says, okay, I'll give you signs. And so he gives Moses 2 signs to show to the people. And obviously he gives many more signs for Moses to show to Pharaoh. And so they have signs presented to them to see and hear and taste and sense in every different way. And so they believe the testimony of Moses based on the signs which are given as evidence that Moses is telling the truth. Now, if we think about Moses, the things that Moses, according to tradition, has said and reported, these things are commonly rejected by modern scientists. Why? Because even though Moses claims to have seen them and heard them, they have not seen them and heard them. So they reject it as not scientific. It's just religion or superstition. This chemistry student, with respect to the chemistry book and the men who write the book, is in the same position as the scientists are with respect to the scriptures or the teaching of the Catholic Church. This student has not observed these things directly, and he doesn't have, in his own thinking, he doesn't have reason to be persuaded that they're true. And so he says, look, I don't have evidence. You can tell me that Dr. McGillicuddy of whatever university ran an experiment and demonstrated this, but I wasn't there. I didn't see that reported experiment. And aren't these experiments supposed to be reproducible? So don't I have reason to say I'm going to respond to this assertion in my chemistry book not with natural belief. I don't know these chemists. I don't know the author of this book like I know the zookeeper. I'm not going to believe the content of my chemistry book. And by the way, I think we can all provide examples where these teachers and writers have been wrong. That's why we have new editions of every chemistry book. Isn't that the reason? I hope that that's the reason. I hope they don't come out with new editions of the chemistry book just to make more and more money. So you can't use version 2. Now you have to buy the 8th edition and pay another $120. I hope it's because they're actually improving errors that were in the first book, and the books are getting better and better over time, and they're not just restating the same things in new editions to force everyone to buy the books again. It's assumed that they're correcting things. We can give many examples of things that were taught as scientific fact 400 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 25 years ago, 10 years ago, which are now doubted or completely rejected. And yet when the student sits in front of the chemistry book and says, I don't know if this is true, why do I have to accept this? And he gets scoffed at as if he's crazy and unreasonable. That's not scientific. And I think that this is a big problem in modern education. And it's one of the, we're really abusing science. We're really taking advantage of students and presenting them with something that we introduce with all of this talk of the scientific method, and we need to observe things, we need to test things, we need to make sure that what we're told is true, we need to make sure that what we think is true, we need to propose hypotheses, but then we need to test them, and we need to be willing to abandon our hypotheses if the tests show them to be incorrect. We're presenting this as a really wild pursuit of truth through demonstration. And then at the same time, when someone raises an objection to something that has not been demonstrated, at least to them, we treat them like they're some kind of crazy person. And so we sit, or students sit in these classes, and they just absorb all this information, much of which contradicts things that they're taught in religion classes or in other philosophy classes. And now they've got this dilemma. But what's strange about the dilemma is that they're almost pressured to accept the scientific information more than they're pressured to accept the theological information. You know, if they open up, let's say, a New American Bible, and they read through the New American Bible and then glance at the notes, there's nothing in the New American Bible that's not open to doubt or reconsideration or explanation in some new way. There are almost, direct contradictions of what the scriptures say in the notes. And you can say, well, is what's said here in the notes, is it possible to reconcile with the text? Yes, but I know for certain that that is not what this saint or that doctor thought that this passage means. It's very comfortable for modern Catholics to just dismiss traditional explanations of things, traditional views, traditional teachings that were in print less than 100 years ago. no problem dismissing those things. But if you think to object to something in a science book, you're reacted to with scoffing and mockery as if you're a crazy person. And that in the context of what is supposed to be a material science course where every truth is established by evidence. So what I believe that students need to be taught in natural sciences is that you are perfectly right to doubt anything that has not been demonstrated to you, because it has not been presented as scientific information. It has been presented with nothing other than philosophical or even theological evidence. And so if you're sitting in a science class after reading all about the scientific method and you hear something and you say, well, I'm not, the book doesn't provide us any evidence that that's true, it just tells us, and you say, I'm going to suspend the acceptance of that until I have evidence, because this is a science class after all. And we all know that these books are revised constantly and things are changed. And some will say, oh, it's just, no, it's not just minor stuff. It's stuff that 400 years ago was presented to Christian people as being absolutely certain, demonstrated by reproducible experiments, and later somehow found to not be true. And then that new teaching was presented as scientifically certain, demonstrated by experiments, absolutely true, observed by many different experiments, and yet later rejected as false, which is supposed to be impossible. And every time there's a new wave of teaching in scientific circles, it's presented with the absolute authority of demonstrated scientific evidence, only to somehow be found to not be true. And so we've seen this again and again through history. You know, for example, we'll hear people criticize the Catholic Church because they'll say, oh, I guess Galileo was wrong, right? You know, you're a Catholic, so I guess you believe that Galileo was wrong. Well, you know, actually Galileo was wrong. And so, you know, what exactly are you arguing? Are you arguing that Galileo, who rejected the traditional view of cosmology and astronomy, are you saying that when he rejected that and presented his opinion as absolutely certain scientific evidence, are you saying that what he claimed to be exactly scientifically true is in fact scientifically true? Well, then you're wrong, because Galileo's ideas were not confirmed by the evidence. And then we had Copernicus, and then we had others, and then we had others, and we had others. We have Isaac Newton coming with his views of physics and his laws of nature, what's called classical physics, which are now doubted because of Einstein's theory of relativity. So what now? When Newton's ideas were presented as absolutely certain and scientifically demonstrated and unquestionable, if anyone objected to them then or didn't feel comfortable because they didn't see these things demonstrated, was it right for them to have been treated like crazy, superstitious people? But this is what happens. Science is always presented as absolutely certain, demonstrated by many reproducible experiments by honest men, all recorded. Everything has been established and published somewhere for all to see. And this story goes on and on. And again, I've done this. If you ask people, when did you observe the demonstration of this truth, which you present so forcefully? When did you experience the demonstration of this scientifically? I never meet people who say, oh, I have the evidence right here. Let me show you. Here, clear the table. I'll show. I don't meet people who do that. I don't meet people who ever present evidence. Think about the textbook. Does the textbook making the assertion also present the evidence? If not, why not? If not, why trouble the student? I would rather say to my students, here's what scientists say about this. Now, you don't have to accept this. It's simply helpful to know what this group of scientists, because they don't agree with this group, by the way. We've got different groups of scientists who disagree on these issues. So we're not going to present this as if this is the Catholic faith delivered once for all. There's all different kinds of groups who disagree, and they don't present demonstrative evidence. And so what happens in the philosophy of science today, and this is an important point, if you were to say, hey, scientists, let me ask you a question. You know, back when Francis Bacon was writing, he said that everything concerning the natural world needed to be demonstrated by reproducible experiments that were accessible to the senses, or at least to the senses with the assistance of instruments. Is what we're being taught here, has it been demonstrated in that way? Can it be demonstrated in that way? And what we'll find in the philosophy of science is that that's no longer even what scientists claim in their teachings. And you can hear the language of modern science because it doesn't talk about evidence. What it talks about is consensus. It talks about consensus. And so the question, what makes this to be scientific, is no longer reproducible experiment. It's no longer direct observation. It's no longer demonstration. It's now a kind of professional bullying, where the majority of whoever this consensus is, I don't know how we identify the consensus or who the consensus is, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm asking honestly, when someone tells me that I should accept this because this is what the consensus says, that's another assertion presented to me without evidence. And even if the consensus, again, what does that mean? Does that mean a simple majority? A simple majority happen to agree on this point? What about the other scientists who don't agree? Are they crazy people? Why are they allowed to disagree? Are they not scientific? If they're not scientific, why are they called scientists? And so we're presented now, in the 21st century, we're presented with this idea of the consensus, of the collective opinion of the scientific community. And so the goalposts are moving, and the original definition of natural science is no longer true. And yet then, when we talk about chemistry, we pretend that that idealistic view of science is what we mean when we talk about chemistry, even though that's not what we mean when we talk about chemistry. So when this student is objecting and doesn't know if he should believe this or not, he's met with these like Baconian teachers who pretend that this crazy heretic is rejecting the demonstrations of scientists, which he could see if he wants to right across the hall in the laboratory where everything in the book is being demonstrated daily. But that's not at all what science is even about in the 21st century. And so I see this as a problem where we're not being honest about what science really is. We're not being honest about what the purpose of scientific studies really is. And so this message is presented to Catholic students, which, again, if you're watching this video, makes you think that if you open up a biology textbook or a chemistry textbook or a physics or an ecology textbook or any subject, and you read something in the text that you don't think is right or you think contradicts what you've been taught to believe as a Catholic, you should now start doubting whether you're reasonable or whether you're some kind of, a crazy person, some crazy superstitious person. Because when you read that chapter about the foundation of the world, from the Big Bang, X billion years ago, and you say, huh? You're immediately classified as some kind of crazy person who rejects all the evidence. And yet, it's like the emperor's new clothes. It's who has actually seen the evidence. And I'm not, in saying that, I'm not denying that it's possible, but what I'm expressing doubt. I'm not denying that it's possible, but I'm acknowledging, as I certainly should, that I have no way of claiming that that is scientific knowledge with no evidence presented to me. And it's not reasonable for me to believe in someone called scientists, because that's nothing like the example where I know the zookeeper and he said he saw the lion. That's not the same set of circumstances that this chemistry student faces. So I have, as I said, I have an objection to this example here. I don't think this is good teaching. I think this is dangerous teaching for Catholic students, especially because they're going to face so many things in their science textbooks that are objectionable and worthy of doubt, if not rejection. And if this kind of peer pressure, this academic pressure, is put on students who don't understand that they're perfectly justified to say, no, I don't believe that, nor do I have evidence that that's true. In fact, I think it's probably false, even though in humility, I will acknowledge that it could be true, but I'll leave that for the so-called scientist to actually demonstrate to me by means of reproducible experiments. That's the reasonable position to take. That's the reasonable position. Not this, oh, science, we should always trust in science, where the consensus of scientists has become something of a magisterium on natural knowledge that they no longer even need to demonstrate. It's like once you're a member of the magisterium, once you're a member of the consensus, once the consensus is established, they're just speaking, ex cathedra, telling the world what the consensus says, and we're saying, oh, well, the consensus. So, is that really what science is supposed to be? I don't think so. I know that Francis Bacon would not agree that that's what science is supposed to be. And again, if I'm just going to trust in the consensus, then it was wrong for the scientific revolution to ever happen in the first place, because those wackos should have trusted the consensus. And so I think there's real problems with this. I think that this way of thinking and approaching the natural sciences is not reasonable. I think it's crippling to Catholic students, and I think many Catholics can feel, we talk about the sense of the faithful, they can feel that there's something in a certain idea or a certain teaching that does not harmonize with the Catholic faith, with Catholic sentiment. They can feel some discord. And when they express that, they're attacked as if it's crazy for them to say what they feel. And then when the science changes in the future and the scientists come to a different conclusion, no one goes back to that Christian and says, hey, we're sorry for calling you crazy and superstitious because it turns out the evidence was actually on your side. We saw that in the recent COVID craziness, where there were people attacked as crazy. And we were literally told, in the light of this video, we were literally told to trust the science, when what everyone was actually asking was, what science? Where is the science? We don't even know what the science is. You're telling us to trust the science. Trust what science? And we see that this is what is happening in modern society. And anyone who raises an objection is criticized as being some kind of conspiracy theorist, some kind of crazy flat earther, because they simply have reason to doubt and are being treated as if doubt is unreasonable and belief in science is reasonable, which it's not. So I think that this is a big problem in modern education. I think it's a big problem in modern Catholic culture. And I think it's one of the reasons why, by not developing a right respect for science, by not holding scientific learning and teaching accountable to what scientific learning is supposed to actually be, but allowing it to just run wild into every field with no evidence and make assertions and then appeal to the consensus, we've just created a counterfeit magisterium, as it were, that we all are being told to listen to and obey by some kind of faith that is completely unwarranted and unreasonable to grant. So if this was my student, I would say, until you're shown evidence, you have every right to doubt. And what I would tell the student is, in your notes, just keep notes of these things. If there's something you read that's taught in your book and you say, I don't think that's true, write about it, jot that down, make a note, and then look and then study it and look into it. That's what motivates real scientific study. This is one of the reasons why we don't have minds like Einstein, because who was Einstein believing when he rethought physics and astronomy? Who was he bowing to in trust and obedience when he rejected Newton? We see that the minds of the great thinkers, they didn't think of science the way that students are taught to think of science. And it's one of the reasons why students don't actually have an interest in real science. They just see science as a means to making money through some secular career, rather than being excited about the sport of real scientific investigation. So I'm not presenting an anti-scientific view. I'm presenting what I think is a more perfect and inspiring view of the natural sciences. So anyway, I wanted to share this because watching this video, I was surprised to hear it articulated so clearly. I think this is a major problem in modern Christian education. And I know in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I take it very seriously to make modern studies available for our students, even though we're a classical study program. And what I tell them very clearly is, because parents will object or kids will want to study these things, I'll say, listen, it's good for us to study these subjects because it's good for us to hear what other people have to say. It's good for us to hear what this so-called consensus of scientists has to say. It's good for us to hear what the scientific community is publishing. It's good for us to think about it, and it's good for us to put it to the test. It's good for us to make sure we understand things accurately, so if we do develop arguments, if we do object, we can do so and actually respond to their actual message rather than some straw man. So there is reason to study these things, but we should not be telling kids, in my opinion, we should not be telling kids that when you read a science book, you should just turn off the brain and go into some sort of religious submission to the content of your science book, because all of this is certain and was demonstrated by someone else. So that is contrary to fact. So anyway, I'd like to know what you think. I'd like to know if you've experienced this, because I certainly have. I've had people try to accuse me of being some kind of superstitious, crazy person because I don't accept something of the consensus, even though I think I have reason for my view. And when pressed, those who speak confidently of these things have no evidence. I think that these things are, I've experienced that sort of treatment. I know exactly what it feels like and what it looks like and what kind of person does that to students. But anyway, that's my thought as I was watching this video. I wanted to share that, get your thoughts. Again, for anyone thinking that I'm critical of the Thomistic Institute, that's the furthest thing from the truth. These videos that they produce are really beautiful and brilliant. Some of them have the most concise and helpful explanations of some of the most complicated lessons in philosophy, and they're just invaluable. And the way that they produce them is really beautiful. And I encourage you to watch this Aquinas 101 series and go through all the content of the Thomistic Institute, because it's really wonderful. This is the only thing I think I have ever seen in one of their videos where I just said, I don't think that's right. So I'd like to know what you think. I hope that's helpful. God bless.